Just how far would you be willing to go to survive? When death tightens its icy grip around you, would you do whatever it takes to cling on to life just a little longer, or would you rather starve than embrace humanity's most abhorrent taboo? At the 11th century siege of Ma'ara, a desperate band of crusaders found themselves facing a nightmarish choice: a slow, lingering death through starvation, or something far darker, as what began as a holy mission, a noble quest in the name of God, descended into a literal hell on earth. This is the story of how unbearable hunger and overwhelming despair can break even the strongest spirit, as men who had arrived at the city as proud warriors of God only weeks before left that place as something else entirely. In 1095, the crumbling Byzantine Empire was in danger of being completely overrun. In the east, a Muslim Turkish dynasty known as the Seljuks had conquered vast swathes of land that had been under Christian Byzantine rule for centuries. The emperor in Constantinople realized that he no longer commanded the power necessary to stop them. In desperation, he looked to his Christian brothers in the faith in the west and called on the Catholic Pope in Rome for military aid. Pope Urban II answered the call. What became known as the First Crusade was launched in August 1096 in response to this appeal for help. Its goals were simple but ambitious: stem the tide of the Muslim advance into Byzantine territory, restore Christian control over the Holy Land, and reopen pilgrimage routes from Europe to Jerusalem. Europe was gripped by religious fervor as thousands of people from all walks of life took up arms and prepared to march east. The Pope had framed the endeavor not just as a military expedition, but as a spiritual pilgrimage, a means by which even the common people might have all of their sins erased. This tantalizing promise of eternal salvation swelled the ranks of the Crusader army with over 100,000 souls, many of whom were untrained peasants armed with little more than sticks and stones, who had no idea what lay ahead of them. The Pope and the Byzantine Emperor had unwittingly opened Pandora's box. This massive host was not one army, but many. The Pope had merely called for the crusade. He had no intentions of organizing it or leading it. A chaotic mix of different nationalities, cultures, and classes, all speaking different languages, following different leaders, and containing violent opportunists and religious fanatics, were set loose on foreign lands at the same time with no discipline, unified leadership, or chain of command, or sufficient supply lines to keep them fed. It was a recipe for disaster. As this great, snaking caravan of over 100,000 people made its way towards Jerusalem, it ravaged the land and emptied markets of anything edible like a ravenous swarm of locusts. For the vast majority of Crusaders, the only food available would be whatever they could buy, scavenge, or steal. For the entire campaign, their survival would depend on their ability to live off the land. However, the land could only feed a limited number of hungry mouths. The road to Jerusalem was long and fraught with danger, and as their limited initial supplies quickly ran out, the rank-and-file Crusaders soon fell into extreme privation. It didn't take long for their initial enthusiasm to wane. The vast majority of the Crusaders were poor peasants whose only possessions were the weapons they carried and the clothes they wore on their backs. As the weeks and months passed, the hardships they endured quickly began to mount and take a serious toll on their ability to fight. Discipline began to break down. Sleeping out in the open, constantly exposed to the elements, their bellies seemingly permanently empty, all while being attacked by hostile forces at every step of the way, the rank-and-file Crusaders began to wonder whether they had made a grave mistake by leaving their homes. This growing feeling of dread and regret was compounded by the frustratingly slow progress of their journey. Besieging and capturing a well-defended city could take several weeks, months, or even years, depending on how well supplied it was. During a lengthy siege, the Crusaders would often find themselves with far less to eat than the very people they were besieging. They would be forced to forage the surrounding countryside for whatever scraps they could find to eat, while their enemies comfortably feasted within the city's walls, fostering envy and resentment that would all too often be taken out on civilians, with violent consequences whenever a city eventually fell. Hunger was now a permanent companion as the men lived on the brink of starvation, a couple of missed meals capable of being the difference between life and death. By the time the Crusaders arrived at the siege of Antioch in modern-day Turkey, they were already in a bad way. However, the 8-month siege that lay ahead of them would set the stage for one of the darkest chapters of the First Crusade. Weary contingents of the Crusader army began arriving outside the gates of Antioch in October 1097, after more than 1 year on campaign. When they first laid eyes on the city's formidable fortifications, they realized that a direct assault was futile. Ringed by thick stone walls, reinforced by over 400 imposing towers, Antioch loomed tall on the horizon, like an impregnable bastion. The disheartened Crusaders resigned themselves to commencing what would likely be a long and frustrating siege, hoping to starve the city into submission without a fight, before continuing their journey to Jerusalem. However, the Seljuk governor of Antioch had long anticipated the Christians' attack and had ample time to stockpile huge reserves of food and supplies. The Crusaders had no such luxury. Their food supplies were already all but exhausted, and after stripping the surrounding area of anything they could eat, foraging parties containing thousands of soldiers were sent to scout further afield for supplies. By December of 1097, the Crusaders' food supply was so low that the men began eating their horses, pack animals, and even dogs, while others resorted to eating leather and even grass in a desperate but futile attempt to stave off hunger, and as many as 1 in 5 would die of starvation before the siege ended. With their already unbearable torments compounded by unseasonably bad rain and cold weather, huge swathes of the army began deserting. It seemed as if the siege and entire crusade was about to collapse. It was at this very moment of crisis that a miracle occurred. After 8 grueling months of suffering and despair, Bohemund of Taranto, one of the leaders of the Crusaders' Norman contingent, managed to bribe an Armenian soldier inside the city to open the gates to the tower he guarded in exchange for the promise of money and a title. On the 3rd of June 1098, Antioch finally fell to the Crusaders. Overjoyed with the unexpected victory, the starving Christian army poured into the city, eager to feast upon the bountiful food supplies they had convinced themselves were hidden within. However, their joy soon turned to dismay and then anger when they realized that the city's imagined rich stockpiles of food had almost run out. Madness seized the city as it quickly transformed into a nightmarish scene of death and destruction. Houses were set ablaze, and civilians were hunted down and slaughtered or enslaved as the streets ran red with blood. Yet despite scouring the city for every morsel of food, the Crusaders could find little to alleviate their unbearable hunger. The land had been stripped bare of anything to eat for hundreds of miles in all directions. The presence of tens of thousands of men in one place over a period of 8 months had drained the stockpiles of every merchant, settlement, and farm in the region. They were stranded in the middle of a food desert. They had captured Antioch, but there would be no celebrations. The men were keen to leave as soon as possible and continue on to Jerusalem, their ultimate goal. However, the leaders descended into petty squabbling as each baron jostled for position. While the nobles wasted precious time arguing over who should rule Antioch, a large Muslim relief army arrived and began a second siege of the city. The trapped Christians were greatly outnumbered. If they met the Muslim army in battle, they would surely be defeated. However, remaining inside the city would also bring about their doom. With each passing day, their numbers shrank, and those still alive grew weaker. It wouldn't be long until they could no longer lift the weight of their swords. For 3 long weeks they suffered, as different factions argued over the best course of action. Racked by hunger, disease, and exhaustion, and with little else to occupy their time, many of the starving crusaders began experiencing strange visions and hallucinations, with one of these leading to the reported discovery of the Holy Lance buried beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter. As the men dug up what was believed to be the spear that had pierced the body of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross during his crucifixion, a new wave of vigor washed over the men. They were convinced that God was on their side, and morale skyrocketed. They immediately took up arms, rushed outside of the city gates, and attacked the Muslim army laying siege to the city, their leader Raymond of Aguilers proudly carrying the Holy Lance before them. As they charged forward, some soldiers had more visions of 3 saints riding along with them. The Crusaders were now certain that they could not be defeated, and fueled by religious frenzy and zeal, the frail, starving warriors somehow managed to sweep aside their foes in the brief but decisive Battle of Antioch. With the siege miraculously lifted, control of Antioch was handed over to Bohemond, the baron who had bribed the city guard to open the gates, and a detachment of crusaders finally marched onwards. Although their long-term aim was to capture Jerusalem, their short-term goal was far humbler. They had to find food and find it fast, or they would all die here. Their next target was the unfortunate city of Ma'ara, a small but wealthy trade hub that acted as a strategically important warehouse along the trade route to Jerusalem. The city was the perfect springboard for the Crusaders' planned final march on Jerusalem in the south. Here they could rest up, resupply and recover their strength before finally seizing Jerusalem and completing their holy mission. However, an initial expedition against the city discovered that it was defended by a far larger garrison than anticipated. A rapid attack and capture would likely be costly, but for men who were already starving, the prospect of yet another long siege with little or no food was enough to push them over the edge. As the Crusader army constructed a mighty siege tower and began their attack on the city's walls, many of the soldiers were determined to find food no matter what. With winter looming, the months of suffering they had endured at the earlier siege of Antioch seems to have flipped a moral switch in the minds of hundreds of men at the same time. They were now prepared to consider the unthinkable in their quest to feed. After 2 weeks of vicious fighting that saw both sides suffer heavy casualties, the hunger-maddened Crusaders finally breached the city walls and forced their way in on December the 11th, 1098. The sight of these emaciated, wild-eyed warriors rampaging through the streets of their home must have been like something out of a nightmare for the people of Ma'ara. These men were no longer driven by any higher ideals of religion or honor, but merely by the base desire to feed. The torments they had endured had transformed many of them into beasts who were now slaves to their lower instincts. By the next morning, the city had become a charnel house. A European eyewitness to the sack of the city later described the terrible scene. Quote, "No corner of the town was clear of Saracen corpses, and one could scarcely go about the streets except by treading on their dead bodies." The Crusader leaders had negotiated a peaceful surrender of the city's remaining garrison that was still holed up in the central bastion, promising them safe passage in return for surrendering the main keep. However, some of the poorer and hungrier Crusaders ignored or simply refused to abide by these terms, and promptly wiped out the garrison after they had laid down their arms, adding to an already excessive death toll that is said to have been as high as 20,000 soldiers and civilians. The situation was spiraling out of control, as even the Crusader leaders grew shocked and disgusted by the atrocities that were unfolding as their army split into competing factions. However, things were about to get even worse. Despite scouring every corner of the city and even torturing civilians to reveal the location of hidden stockpiles of food, there were simply not enough supplies remaining to feed a starving Crusader army that numbered over 10,000 men. For men who had already been on the brink of starvation and death for months, the loss of this last false hope was too much to bear. The chilling realization that there would be no end to their hunger was the final straw for many. The Crusaders had spent months subsisting on whatever scraps of grain or barley they could scavenge, and any roots or plants they could dig out of the soil. Meat was a distant dream, but ever present in their thoughts, their memories of its tender and sweet taste a cruel torture. Yet the desperate men soon realized that with the fresh corpses of their enemies piled high around them, meat was in fact in plentiful supply. The walls of Ma'ara contained a veritable bounty of flesh that rivaled any well-stocked market. With nothing left to lose but perhaps their souls, contingents of the army decided to commit one of the most taboo acts in human history. Over the course of the next month, many began feasting on the flesh of the fallen in a final, desperate attempt to stave off death, with some even said to have consumed flesh that was deep into the process of decomposition and putrefaction, as many of the bodies had been dead for over 15 days. Multiple eyewitness accounts of these acts of cannibalism still survive to this day. Raymond of Aguilers, a Frankish chaplain who was present at the siege and fall of Ma'ara, and who later wrote a chronicle of the First Crusade, described how after taking the city, the starving crusaders consumed human flesh openly and in full view of others, without shame, shocking and disgusting the city's civilians, as well as other crusaders who refused to partake in the macabre feasting, preferring to starve to death than join their brother's profane banquet. Fulcher of Chartres later wrote, quote, "I shudder to tell that many of our people, harassed by the madness of excessive hunger, cut pieces from the buttocks of the Saracens already dead there, which they cooked, but when it was not yet roasted enough by the fire, they devoured it with savage mouth." Yet this version of open cannibalism has been contradicted by other chroniclers. Writing later in 1105, Baldric of Borguel confirms that the flesh of dead Turkish soldiers was indeed eaten. However, he asserts that it was done so secretly. Quote, "The Crusaders would leave the town stealthily, light fires and cook the Turkish flesh, and when they had consumed their unspeakable banquets, they would return as if they had done nothing of the sort." Gilbert of Nogent, another historian of the First Crusade, agrees with this version of events. Quote, "Some of our men who were entirely without resources cut pieces of flesh from corpses, cooked them and ate them, but this was done rarely and in secret, so that no one could be sure whether they actually did this." These alternative accounts suggest that the perpetrators were ashamed of their actions, and that cannibalism was frowned upon by the wider Crusader army, while also allowing the allegations to be presented as mere rumour and hearsay, distancing the First Crusade from the alleged dishonourable actions of a handful of its members. Yet some chroniclers go even further, suggesting that the rumours of cannibalism were intentionally spread by the Christians themselves to instill fear in their enemies. They speculate that the eating of the dead was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a prudent strategy of war to discourage further resistance amongst the enemy, forcing quick surrenders and avoiding the kind of long, drawn-out sieges that had plagued the Crusaders on their journey so far. By making a public spectacle of cooking and eating the flesh of the dead, they could ensure that tales of their barbarity spread far and wide, horrifying the enemy and convincing them that the Crusaders were bloodthirsty savages who could not be resisted, persuading foes to agree to unfavourable truces with the Franks, rather than face them in battle and risk their own flesh filling the bellies of these wild barbarians. One Christian archbishop even justified cannibalism by stating that eating the bodies of infidels is still making war on them. Yet many of the surviving accounts of the First Crusade place the blame for cannibalism squarely on the shoulders of an unusual subgroup of the Crusader army known as the Tafurs. These religious fanatics followed their own leader known as the King of the Tafurs, took strict oaths of poverty, and were rumoured to conduct themselves with extreme barbarism and ferocity. The leaders of the Crusade were incapable of reining the Tafurs in, as they acted independently in pursuit of their own objectives, which usually consisted of destroying everything they saw and killing anyone they encountered. They are said to have worn no shoes and little clothing, wielded simple weapons such as clubs and hatchets, lived off of meager diets, and camped separately far away from the main Crusader force, existing as an inconvenient and barely tolerated group of extremists who were fit for one job and one job only: terrorizing the enemy, a job they are said to have excelled at. The Tafurs are said to have roasted the bodies of fallen soldiers in full view of the enemy and made a great show of hungrily devouring the cooked flesh. Whether they actually ate the dead, or if it was all merely for show, is still disputed, but what's not in doubt is the effect that these acts had on enemy soldiers. As rumours of the Tafurs' actions spread across the Holy Land, they became the most dreaded foe of the Muslims, who saw these untamable barbarians as more akin to devils than men. Tales of the Tafurs' atrocities grew in popularity in the decades and centuries after the Crusade. However, many historians suspect that they were simply being used as convenient scapegoats to divert the blame for cannibalism towards the poor, thus keeping the reputation of the main Crusader force untarnished. At that time, poorer soldiers would often open the bodies of the dead to look for gold and silver coins hidden in the stomach. During a medieval siege, it was common practice to swallow valuables in an effort to hide them from enemy troops, and so the stomachs of the fallen could often prove to be a veritable treasure trove. For many, it was easily believable that given the right conditions, the poorer elements of the army might be tempted to go even further. The entire military campaign was portrayed as a heroic enterprise to carry out God's heavenly will on earth, a divine intervention in the affairs of mortals that was supposed to set right an unnatural wrong, returning Jerusalem into the hands of the Christians. Even in the context of extreme hunger and deprivation, the rumours of the dark events that took place during the siege of Ma'ara could never be officially recognised, lest the entire crusade be discredited. The main Crusader force eventually left behind the ruins of Ma'ara and arrived at Jerusalem just 6 months later, taking the city after a short but bloody siege. However, despite the ultimate success of their campaign, the legacy of the veterans would be forever plagued by the dark rumours swirling around the capture of the city of Ma'ara, rumours which highlighted the uncomfortable truth about the darker side of human nature in times of extreme desperation. While we might be quick to judge from the comforts of the modern day, might you have done the same in their place given the right circumstances? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.